Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel on risk management and perspectives on risk management, building agility. I want to introduce my boss, Dr. Watret here. He will say a few welcoming words to the panelists here, and then we'll get on with the show. Dr. Watret.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone to the first live Vantage Point discussion. We've had several virtual ones, like everything else in this world now. Virtual has been the standard. Now we're getting back to in person, so we appreciate you taking the time to be here with us for that. I'm John Watred. I'm the Chancellor of the Worldwide Campus of Embry-Riddle, and so I'd like to welcome everyone here in person and those that are going to be online virtually with us, and especially to our panelists who are here to give that. They're going to give us the benefit for our students and all the stakeholders who are joining us virtually throughout this program. You know, risk, especially in this part now with pandemic, risk is an important topic that especially today as we look through it. And if the pandemic has taught us something, that we have to, those organizations have to acknowledge and plan for and control risk. Otherwise, they're going to have difficulty surviving in this type of environment. And especially now with a pandemic, it puts more emphasis on that planning for the future. So I hope you enjoyed the Vantage Point talk today. I'm sure you've got a great discussion from our panelists. And I want to thank Philip and Sean for your willingness to be here and give us your views and your wisdom on risk management for it. And with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed Dean of the College of Business, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Vantage Point speaker series hosted by the Worldwide College of Business. My name is Maneesh Sharma. I'm the Dean of College of Business at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University Worldwide Campus. And I want to personally welcome each and every one of you, those of you who are here with us live, I can clear my throat at the same time, and those who are joining us virtually. I was okay this morning. I don't know what happened. So maybe I'm a little bit nervous. No, I'm not. So thank you again for being here. Today's panel discusses agility and resilience in organizations and the benefit thereof in the organization. To frame our discussion, let me just define how we view resilience. Resilience for an organization is the ability to continue to operate when faced with challenges, and agility is the ability to adapt and anticipate and adapt, rather, I should say, in that order, to the challenges. Certainly, I think we're all aware that COVID-19 has reinforced the values in businesses, small and large organizations globally, the value of being agile and the value of being a resilient organization and business. And I think we've all heard stories of distilleries making basically hand sanitizers and clothing manufacturers making face masks and so forth. So it's been, and we know those businesses over the last year and a half that had more dynamic and flexible business models have done really well, and those that have not had flexible models have not done so well. Closer to home, which is us, College of Business, we were acutely aware of the importance of risk in higher education. So about 3 years ago, we embarked on a journey, essentially as a college with the leadership team. We wanted to have a theme of risk management, specifically high reliability organization, which connects with the aviation world, and/or enterprise risk management. And our graduate degrees, as a result of that study, now include actually risk management as a framework for all the graduate degrees. So we're pretty proud of that, and it's pretty timely that our panelists, who are experts in risk management, are here to share their wisdom with us. So with that introduction, I'd like now to welcome our panelists who come from a variety of backgrounds, from private sector, from higher education. Unfortunately, you'll see that 2 of the 4 panelists are unable to join us today. Eric Mai from Delta had a jury summon And for those of you who don't, who may or may not know about this, jury is just a legal obligation, and you're just a prisoner of the court system, so to speak. And if you can't go, then you can't go. And second one is Rocky Wiggins, who's the Chief Information Officer for Spirit Airlines. Just got summoned into I think an emergency meeting with the CEO or the Team 1 at Spirit, so he's unable to join us for that reason. So let me move on and introduce our panelists here shortly. Two of us. To my immediate right is Sean Torkasi. Sean is a partner and runs the ERM, Enterprise Risk Management practice for PricewaterhouseCoopers for the US practice. It's a pretty significant size practice. I won't mention the numbers, but it has lots of zeros in it, suffice it to say. And Sean joins us from Seattle, and he's flown in last night for this explicit reason for being with us today. So thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
And then to Sean's right is Philip Benswan. I'd like to say I practiced so much about pronouncing Philip's name. I wanted to call Philip Philippe Benswan with a French bent, but I was told that he's not French. But so I just have to say Philip Benswan. But Philip is the Director of Risk and Security for the UCal system, University of California system. And he joins us also from West Coast, San Diego. So thank you, gentlemen, both, for being with us and sharing your wisdom. We're awfully tickled to have you. We're grateful to have you here and appreciate what you will have to share with us. So with that, if you'll give me the honors, we'll start. Okay, so one more thing. This is the housekeeping. So this session is being broadcasted. So we have someone, those of you who are in the virtual audience, if you have a question, please put it in your chat box. And then as we get into the session, so first 50 minutes are design questions. I'll be asking a couple of questions of the panelists. And then the following half an hour or so, we'll open it up to audience, which is you and people who are virtually. So if you're virtually, please put your question in the chat box. And if you're here, then please raise your hands and we'll get to you as quickly as possible. So those are the housekeeping things. So with that, we'll start our discussion. So the opening question for both of the panelists, I'll start with you, Sean, on this one, is if there's one lesson that we've learned from COVID-19, it is that agility and resilience matter in businesses. What factors, in your opinion, make an organization resilient and agile? And how do these factors help to prepare organizations to face the next inevitable shock?
Well, thank you. And first, before I jump in to the response, I just wanted to thank you, Maneesh, yourself, and the university for having me here. In terms of a background, you mentioned PwC partner, and ERM is one of the things I do every day, but I also interact with organizations, leadership teams across the board, and help them understand their position around risk and thinking about aligning strategy to risk. And so you'll hear a lot of comments really from both of us around this concept today of alignment. And so please do raise your hand, ask some questions. Those online, please reach out and provide some questions. We'd love to be challenged. We both talked last night that there's no question that we won't take. So please reach out. But in terms of your question, no doubt COVID-19 has opened our eyes to a number of challenges, to say the least. I think organizations large and small are trying to figure out not only dealing with their customer base and how they're interacting differently, but obviously their employees, their operations, whether that's a manufacturing line, whether that's getting, we'll call it content into the hands of the users, like a company like a Facebook or an Instagram, et cetera, that you're all familiar with. When I see that, to your question around agility and resilience and how it matters in business, where I would start is really understanding strategy. I think companies often leave that to the executive team. And as the challenge with that is that the folks in the business, the day-to-day operations that are expected to manage risk through all those areas I mentioned, aren't necessarily aligned to where the company is headed. They may read something, obviously, that's put out. There's all hands meetings, there's various things. Even at a university of this size, student population, or maybe some of the professors don't know exactly what is it the goals of this university and the organization as a whole. And so I think to that question, I would say alignment would be my answer. Yeah. Thank
you, Sean. Philip, the same question to you. The agility and resilience matter in business. What factors make an organization resilient and agile? And how do they help prepare organizations to face the next shock?
Right. Well, again, thank you for having me here. You know, the first thought is you can't see and mitigate what you're not searching for, right? So this leads to questions for an organization. If they want to be agile, then they need to be searching for what could impact them. And that involves some process to look beyond what you're dealing with now, which goes to, you know, the points that you're going to hear in this theme, and have someone question the assumptions of our strategy, right? So there's been a lot said about what was done wrong by multiple organizations for COVID, but my question would be, what were you searching for? What was the organization? How were they searching for risks in the environment? Who had that responsibility? Where were they positioned? Were they in the C-suite? So risk and strategy ought to be, you know, embedded in the leadership of the organization, but they have to have some kind of a mechanism to search the horizon, right? I don't believe anyone here would say pandemic was not a plausible scenario, a plausible risk scenario. So then the question is, what were the plausible risk scenarios that you had in your risk analysis, right? And then, you know, to the idea of being agile, you're only agile in what you practice, right? So if you haven't practiced response, then you're not going to be agile in response. It's going to be clunky, right? So first you need to search. Whoever's searching needs to be positioned well enough to say, here is a warning in the environment that we've just found because we were looking for very specific warning signs. And that person then flags that to the leadership and says, and let's now work on our preparedness strategy that we've practiced. So those elements, those three elements, searching, practicing, and then having someone positioned high enough in the organization to say, let's change now before we're fully impacted and suffer the total consequence of this.
Okay. Maneesh, if I could just add one point, Philip, great points that you've raised. I think to bring that together, it's important to recognize the need and the, you know, for a framework, an established framework that actually is formal. I think a lot of companies will often say, well, we move fast, right? Think about Amazon, think about these other organizations that you hear about and their fail fast mentality. But establishing a framework doesn't necessarily equal slowing down, but it actually allows for those 3 points Philip raised to actually be not only documented, but thought through in an organized manner. And that's what I think we're seeing in the pandemic was a lot of organizations, especially in the Fortune 500, thought about a pandemic or something of that scale, but how they were actually doing what we often refer to as a tabletop exercise or other exercises to have their management team fully understand how to handle that situation was not happening. And so there wasn't a framework for that. There was people talking maybe at a high level. Some organizations would have an ERM program for sheer fact to get, you know, risk factors put into their 10K or their annual report, but they weren't necessarily going through a formal way. And I think that's something, you know, allude to I know some other areas you want to touch on, but where we see companies going and where they're headed is to not only establish that framework, but build it out in a way that drives almost, if you can visualize kind of a hourglass where you have a top down and bottoms up kind of approach that somewhat meets in the middle, where strategy aligns to, you know, the operational risks of the organization.
Well said. Yeah, thank you, Phil.
So, and we'll probably do this because this is the dialogue, right, that gets to the solution, which is combining a bunch of different perspectives on what is it you're trying to accomplish. So this doesn't happen organically, right? And by this, I mean the tabletop exercises, preparedness, that doesn't just happen in an organization. It has to be, as you said, part of a strategy. And one point to the idea of tabletops, this idea of having someone in the organization who questions the process and the strategy, that is really helpful. And that's probably one lesson that hasn't been learned in the history of crisis management and risk management, is having someone in your leadership team whose sole purpose is to say, well, what about this? Why that and not this? Right? How are we positioned to walk through and be agile in this scenario? So the idea of a pre-mortem is essentially saying, let's play our strategy out and say that it's completely failed, right? Rather than let's work through all of the parts that we say there's plan A. Let's assume plan A has failed. How did we get there? Is there anything that we're doing now that would contribute to that outcome? What can we control? What don't we control? And what can we leverage, right? So there was an institution that took out business disruption insurance before COVID. And part of that was because they were anticipating a trade war, but they also had a rider in the insurance policy for a pandemic. That happened because it was part of the strategy, right? Had they instituted that after COVID, first, they wouldn't get the policy, and second, it wouldn't really matter, right? So that's where you're agile. It's on the front end.
And Philip, that's a great point, because the very definition of agile is anticipating something, right? So ability, and I like that the framework of fail fast, because I think that gives you the repetitive exercise. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So second question, Philip, we'll start with you now. Each of you either leads risk management in your organization and or is responsible for managing some aspects of organizational risk. In your view, which of the following do you find to be more challenging? View or experience, both. An organization's ability to identify risks and or the ability to manage risks, and why?
I think most organizations would say that they identify and have registered their risks, right? They've done what I would call their due diligence. So I'll do a bit of variation on a theme. I don't think that it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So I think this is where the strategic advantage can come in, is in this idea of actually asking the questions about what else can we be doing? So going back to this theme, here are some questions for everyone. What process does your organization use to collect information about foreseeable threats? Right? Ask, not just having to register, but then asking the questions of the next step. This is where I think there could be a lot of competitive advantage for an organization, because if you're able to weather the storm, and unfortunately your competition is not as well suited and well positioned, you're going to get through this better financially. The employees are going to see a standard of care that you've provided for them that's above and beyond, right? And we've seen some of this. I think this is one of the, hopefully a lesson that's been learned through this pandemic, is what the impacts on the psychology of your employees and how can you help them to get through something, right? So asking the questions, who has the responsibility to manage these emerging issues? What process is used, to your point, what process is used to mitigate the full impact? And working through those questions, I think that's where we can leverage and become stronger as institutions, as individuals, across all sectors.
Thank you, Philip. Sean, same question to you, particularly in relation to the practice that you lead, risk management for both physical companies and those platform-based companies. Where do you see the most of the challenges? As Philip said, it not easy, but perhaps easier to identify and bulletize risks. Mm-hmm. What's the challenge then? What makes management of risk more challenging and flow down channel in your experience?
No, I really like the question, but I might say I choose door number 3, okay, which is the integration across the company. So I think in terms of, if I think back to me being a student, and the key terms you're looking for when a professor or others are talking, right? Here today, you're going to hear a lot about alignment and integration, right? What I see a lot of organizations, platform-based companies, some that you're using here to, hopefully talk about this great event, or physical, like I'm the lead client partner on the Nordstrom account at PwC, and so I both focus in tech and I focused in consumer markets, and it's such a wild difference, but also there is this interesting similarity around emerging risks and what are they doing that are both good, and what are they doing bad. And what I see the themes are across these organizations isn't that, to Philip's point, everyone is identifying risks and putting them on a risk register. It's kind of 101, right? What is it that matters to us? What do we even risk rank them, right? Prioritize them. Then people start to manage them in terms of moving from ERA, enterprise risk assessment, to enterprise risk management, which is then how do we effectively put in corrective action plans, mitigation plans, monitoring. A lot of companies are struggling with that. I'd say I give most of Fortune 500 a C+ maybe. But then as you think about how are they dealing with this across the organization, massive silos. And I promise you all who are listening in that whether you're a sophisticated university like here or UC, or you're a massive trillion-dollar platform company, or one that just sells shoes and clothes really well, I think that the theme is that there is not necessarily interaction amongst key leaders or even middle management folks around where they see risk and how it's cross-functional. And if they don't understand the dependencies up and down the various life cycle of a transaction or a relationship, then they're going to struggle, right? And that needs to start to happen. So what we recommend, and I promise I'm not skipping too far ahead here, but one of the areas that we focus on is really building this integrated framework so that there is this collaboration. It's definitely a missing piece. People will say, I've got an ERM leader, or I've got a head of crisis. That's great, but they aren't necessarily taking the step to build out that framework and establishing and permeating it throughout the organization, where risks are again funneled up, addressed, and then talked about in terms of how do they tie back to the strategy of a company. You might say that cybersecurity, for example, is a good one that impacts all those organizations I mentioned. Or you might say supply chain. I mean, who hasn't read an article in the last 2 weeks, month about supply chain risk? But really, how does it permeate throughout? And is it just contained? Is it just a procurement issue? Or is it really, is sales involved? Of course they are. Is the various finance organization involved? You could probably say that risk is co-owned by many. So how do you deal with that? And that's obviously easy for me to sit up here and say, we'll build a framework, but you really do have to bring collaboration to the forefront, the same way you've done with innovation, right? When you think about some of the platform companies, or take Amazon, for example, how did they think through getting a package to you in under 24 hours? Well, the process to do that involved many, many, many steps to do from A to Z. Why do we not do that for risk management as well? And that's what at least I, in my role, I'm trying to solve for, every day. So.
Yes, just to add to this question. So, my background, finance, and I often think, and how we were trained is essentially that which you can't see, as Philip has said, anticipate or something. But really, I think one of the struggles, I liken it to like a teenager who's still developing prefrontal cortex, right? So it's developing, and they don't really understand the risks of engaging in risky behavior, right? Whether it's driving fast or driving while intoxicated and so on, because they just can't comprehend that. Are we seeing in businesses, part of the challenge is that in the C-suite, the lack of integration is because they just don't understand, they can't visualize the risks, the size of the risk, or the issue of the risk. Go ahead, Phil.
From my perspective as a practitioner, I would say that it's just the psychology of risk is it's working against us, right? I mean, it's the unknown. You've got the urgent driving out the necessary, right? You've got so much right in front of you that needs to be accomplished. There are immediate risks that you have to deal with. And again, just going back to this theme of having someone who is your strategy advisor, right? Who is there, who is not dealing with the here and now, The psychology of dealing with both the here and now and that which hasn't materialized yet it's very difficult. So I don't think this is a critique on leaders or the organizational culture. I think it's more just an observation of human behavior. It's very difficult to deal with both the here and now, which must be done. You've got to balance your books. You've got to meet your payroll demands. You could go out of business, and we saw that happen in COVID, right? But then thinking beyond that, it's hard to do both of those things. But having someone stand outside the immediate and say, well, okay, I'm not invested in that problem right now. What about this? But to see it as a helpful thing, that's really the challenge I see. And in the research that I've done and just the practical work, it's very helpful to have someone say as a second opinion, just like a physician would get a second opinion. What do you think about this problem? And that's helpful. And I hope that that's one of the lessons, especially for new students, to see the ability to help your peers, not as a competitor, but as a resource. And to help each other, to say, well, I'm seeing this problem. Have you thought about this particular issue? And you're shedding light on something that perhaps because of cognitive dissonance and all these other issues, it's just hard for people to see that.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Just to finish that question off, would you be able to share, an example of an organization that engages in or has engaged in good management, risk management, in your view, has best practice? And why do you think that organization stands out in your mind?
So I'm going to now brag about the University of California. I'm here, on my own accord, not as an official representation, of the University of California.
And I'll second that.
Yeah, but
representing himself.
But I will say this, the university invested in this idea of having a contrarian, having someone who serves as a devil's advocate, and with the specific role of questioning the risk assumptions of our plans, right? And this happened not because of, it wasn't by happenstance. It was part of a strategy. And it was a recognition of some really large risks of any multinational organization. The geopolitical risk, the financial risk, the societal risk, were all embedded in everything we did. And the biggest challenge is how are we aligning with a new dynamic? People are changing their minds about work. So how are we changing our minds and approaching that and meeting people where they are? Because things have changed in the last 24 months. People are deciding maybe it's not worth the impact on the environment to commute. Maybe that's just not something I want to do anymore. So there's been a realization and maybe a reformation of thinking. And so that takes, I think that's a good thing. The risk versus the reward calculus here is, we have a tremendous ability to affect the environment and the way that the future of work, et cetera, by reimagining the way we partner with people. Okay. So that, to me, this is maybe hopefully one of the good things that come out of this pandemic.
Thank you. Philip? Sean? You have,
Yeah, no, I have a couple thoughts here. One, maybe just in terms of audience participation. I'm curious because it'll lead to a point that Philip started on, but just by show of hands really quick, if you were offered the option, when you go to be a full-time post your student time here and you work for various employers, would you consider work from home? Or would you want to be full-time? Like, would you, if you raise your hand, if you would consider, truly working from home versus going into the office every day, at least as a percentage? All right, a few of you, that's good. The reason why I bring it up is, maybe only 6 in the audience out of 20 maybe raised their hand, which is about the percentage we're seeing roughly in our own organization. But imagine that in terms of risk management, that, a few years ago, was that even a thought in most employers' mind, right? Some of the tech, startups considered this with their engineering group, where their productivity was increased when they had less distraction from the environment around them. And so organizations that you see that have been disruptive, right, have taken that. But imagine now every organization needs to be thinking about that, both on their employees, right, to make each of you happy, right, making sure that you get the right experience, but also too for you as a customer, right, of their platform or of their, you know, product. How are you now going to be different in terms of what you do every day versus commuting, versus what you wear, versus how you interact socially, what you eat, and things like that. Everything from grocery will have to change. So I think that the concept of a chief contrarian officer, as much as that may sound odd today, think back a few years ago, we didn't have a chief diversity and inclusion officer. We didn't have some of these chief risk officers. And so this view of having someone out there, and a lot of organizations, I will say, Maneesh, to your question, are starting to create these outside boards, not just a board of directors, but literally a panel of professors and industry experts who can be contrarian to the direction an organization's going or address a specific risk. The example I might like to use, again, not putting any name out there, but imagine some of the social media platforms that you all use. There's some content that's shared, obviously, that is sometimes hard to read, whether you're a parent like us or you're a student and just thinking about, you know, some of the information that's shared. It's going to get a reaction. It's going to cause perhaps you to talk about it, maybe not talk about it. But the idea how a company manages that content, who is responsible for the platform, is extremely complex area. And so having a task force, having a third party may be a great idea to think about, hey, is this really the right path? Is this best aligned to the strategy of the company? Or do we need to refocus? Do we need to look out more than 1 to 2 years? To Philip's point, we're so focused on the near term and making shareholders happy, but how do we look out 5, 7 years to say, wait a minute, we actually have a social responsibility. And what does that mean in terms of our strategy? And how do we get a third party, people that are not necessarily invested in the success of the organization, to provide that color in terms of where they're headed and how they're managing that risk? So I think you're going to start seeing that a lot more.
Sure.
You know, and, you know, it's easy to look back in history and to critique things, you know, with hindsight bias, et cetera. But I would say, you know, when you look at some decisions and you say, well, I wonder who questioned that decision, or why wasn't that decision questioned? Again, if it's not built into the process, it's very hard for a lot of reasons. People are beholden to the organization for their career. There are so many different dimensions of decision-making, which you teach, that make it very hard to question authority. So again, this process that, frankly, I think was missing in a lot of different ways during COVID, now there's an opportunity, right? So there was this process that started years ago, probably through warfare, called red teaming, where a group had the specific role, and the reason, you know, for all this was to play the role of the enemy and to ask those very difficult questions as if you were attacking the organization. So we have hacktivists to do this for IT, but we don't have hacktivists to do it for strategy.
Makes great sense. Thank you. So it's a great segue into the next question, which is, it is said that the biggest risk that we can take is taking none at all. So acknowledging that risk can sometimes be good for an organization. Can you please share your thoughts on the best way for organizations to strike a balance between risk avoidance, which is what we've been discussing thus far, to risk taking? So Sean?
Yeah, I'll start. I think in terms of that, it's a challenging question. And I think where I like to go with this is around maybe rephrasing risk-taking to the phrase risk enablement. It is different in definition, right? You'll often hear about the fail-fest mentality of some of these big giant companies and how they have the cash flow, right? Sometimes when you're playing with house money, you know, it gets a little easier to take risk. But in terms of where I see most companies that are really excelling in this world around risk enablement, I use an analogy that I think some organizations really, it resonates with at least some leaders, from what I'm told, is that think about the brakes on a car. The brakes on a car are not there to force the car to go slower. It's actually there to allow you to go faster, okay? So if you digest that for a minute and think about that in terms of the context of business risk, organizations need to embed, as Philip was saying, risk management activities in the fabric of their strategic planning to almost allow them to take on more risk. And I'm not saying that you'll hear these terms often, and I've looked at some of the ERM curriculum here that's fantastic. And I'm really excited that, you're teaching these terms around, risk tolerance, right? Risk appetite. But when you think around risk tolerance, right, an organization may widen or narrow that depending on the cycle they're in. It doesn't have to be set in stone at Jan 1 every year and then never reevaluated for 5 years. It's one of those things where they can constantly be evolving. But if you continue to push your organization, everyone from engineers to your strategy folks to the finance folks, to know and be transparent around that there are people in the organization that are contrarians, that are helping with risk management activities, you've now embedded it in the fabric and you can push harder. You can take a little bit more risk. And so to your point, I think companies are starting to get there. I think COVID allowed us to see things maybe in a different context, in a different light. I always thought this concept of risk enablement was there, but maybe just not wed within the fabric of an organization. So I would say, in summary to your question, all companies are somewhere in that spectrum of risk avoidance and risk taking, right? You see the far right companies that are literally, pushing, things out, making acquisitions, doing deals, and you're like, wow, where did that come from, right? And they're okay. They are fine with failing. And some that are just more traditional companies, and they don't want any. They have a very, very small risk tolerance. But in the end, if you again embed these concepts, these frameworks, I do believe these more conservative companies can start moving to the right and actually taking more risk because you've now got a process to protect the organization from the downfall of a major crisis bringing them down or something like that happening to where the organization won't function the way that it does today.
Okay, thank you. Follow up. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, I think this is an observation. The idea that it's an intellectual process to think about hard problems, right? And that bleeds into other thinking that you do. It helps you to think better about supply chain. It helps you. So when the question is, what would make it a balance between risk avoidance and risk taking? Well, if you're engaging in this intellectual discussion and you're working through this problem set and you're asking hard questions of each other, you're thinking really precisely about exactly why you're doing what you're doing. You have to ask the first question, right? First principle question is, well, why are we doing this? So through this process, you're engaging in really critical thinking. All the skills you're being taught, you're now applying. It helps people to be more, I think, engaged in the process, to feel they have ownership of risk taking. And so to me, the balance is making it not like triggered by some major event, right? But to say, this is just part of our intellectual curiosity. So I had a discussion with some colleagues, and I said, this is interesting, where you'd think people would be curious, well, why are we doing this or not doing this? And the first question gets eclipsed by, well, we must because, right? So I think this really, if it's in, again, I hate to keep using this term, but part of the strategy really is just thinking better about risk taking, right? Making wiser choices and not looking at it like strategy and risk management, right? As if they are separate and apart. That's probably the biggest change that could be made. Not looking at it like there's a department that thinks about risk, and then there's the strategy department over here, right? And then there's another department that deals with supply chain. You've just created silos. You did this to yourself, right? So that hopefully, again, the idea, let's just do what we say we do, which is get in the room and have these strategy sessions.
Perfect. Sean, as a follow-up on that question, you mentioned that some of the companies, particularly in the tech arena on the West Coast, have historically, as perhaps part of their DNA, because they were founded companies by an individual. Amazon comes to mind, for example, and Facebook is another one that comes to mind, and the like. In just reflecting on what you said and what Philip said, is what do you want to be? It's obviously an important question. We talked about that over breakfast even this morning, which is, do you, in your assessment, if you could read Jeff's mind, Jeff Bezos' mind, I mean, I know he's stepped down as the CEO, but what do you think he would have thought, let's say 10 years ago, right, before all of this, to provide some color to this, which is to say, I want Amazon to be what? Fill in the blanks. And then same question for Mark and his team. And if we were to pose this question to, I know some of the firms that you work with, and so I won't mention names, all of this, but what are their CEOs thinking? What would Microsoft in the neighborhood would think and say, I'm Satya Nadella, I want 10 years from today, I want Microsoft to be fill in the blanks. And then that begins to address this question of, or balancing the question of, okay, if we want to be that, then we're going to have to do whatever the A, B, and C to get there. How does that conversation unfold, just to give our students some color on how that discussion happens in boards?
Yeah, I mean, I've had the pleasure to meet a couple of these incredible leaders, and it's been an honor. And as a PwC partner, we serve them in a number of capacities. I think what I don't want you to take away with is that risk management is necessary to slow them down, or let's just say hinder their innovative spirit, right? In order to be a disruptor, right? And all those organizations you mentioned, even Microsoft, who sometimes gets a bad rap, but they are incredibly successful organization for taking the lead, in dealing with some corporate issues that have existed for a long time. And so I think they've solved major problems. I'll start there. So I don't want anyone to think, hey, Sean and Philip are saying, let's slow down and let's put a whole, a team in a risk committee, and all of a sudden now the future of Facebook now is I don't know, not what it's expected to be. It's more so that as you evolve as a company, so in those early years as an entrepreneurial company, you're given those freedoms to jump ahead and think about still risk, but do it in a calculated way. But now as you become larger and you've built these building blocks and you employ, hundreds of thousands, and you're engaged with, these really tackling these very challenging issues, societal issues, you have more responsibility. And as a result, there's an expectation that you are now aligning your strategy in a way that thinks about risk management more holistically, right? Not just about the bottom line, but about the impact that you have to your customer base, your employee base, et cetera. And so I know that's a little bit of a political answer in terms of, what I'm seeing with these companies. But I think the CEOs are now challenged with, and why some of them step down to kind of create the next thing. What they're good at is because that organization is so massive, and it needs maybe a different style of leader in order to now manage risks after 20 years of operating versus 2 years of operating. So you'll see that some people think, these leaders will step down just because they made enough money or for personal reasons. There's a lot, talked about that, but more so I think it's about what they want to do and create again, get it to the point, and they recognize that, now it's time for other leaders who can then better operate and enable the organization to continue to grow and be successful, but do it in such a way that manages their risks, both societal and operationally in a true fashion. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. So we have time for a last question before we open it up to the panel. So I'll ask this question. As in most cases, the consensus, Philip, this is to you first, best practice theory may not be sufficient in successful management of risk. What have you learned from your experience on what works and what does not work as far as making organizations more resilient?
Yeah, I'll start with the negative. It doesn't work to avoid the problem, right? I think that's properly basic. But again, just think about yourself and, human nature, and it's part of our psyche to say, I'll get to that, and we have terms for this, like cross that bridge when I come to it. And I said to a colleague, some people say, I'm going to jump off of that bridge when I come to it, right? They have no plan. So what doesn't work is, I would say, outsourcing your risk management, right? And there's a difference between getting a trusted advisor and getting help and offshoring or outsourcing completely your corporate social responsibility, or whatever term you want to use for it, right? Because in the end, you have now limited your access and quality control to the issues that might end up harming your business. So that generally, I haven't seen that work, okay, in the long term. And you can see that almost like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off, okay? And it's tragic, and it's really hard to watch, frankly. What does work is this, again, getting back to this idea of thinking through scenarios, engaging in really pragmatic discussions, not about an exercise of how will we deal with this if it happens, but assuming that bad things have happened and working through scenarios, right? That is really restorative. One, again, it helps people to think in a different and creative way about problem solving. It has a residual benefit that leaves the room. People go back and they talk. The experience helps them to think through different problem sets, okay? And the other I would say is asking really good questions amongst your leadership to each other, really hard questions about why are we doing what we're doing now, right? If we're going to do it and the answer is not no, the answer is, okay, is there a better way, a more efficient way for us to do business? What might that look like? Creating these other visions of what the future might look like, right? That helps a lot.
Thank you. Philip, Sean?
Yeah, that's great points, Philip. Thank you. I would say just a couple thoughts in terms of getting tactical into this world of risk management. So you probably have read, or at least if you've taken an ERM course here, I know that you've been asked to read the COSO 2017 ERM framework. PwC had, I guess, the distinct honor to write it, but I would say it's a principles-based framework. And what I find, even though I was proud to be one of the authors, it is very difficult to implement a principles-based framework. Both Philip and I would agree that there's some foundational elements in there that tie back to everything we've said today. But what I think organizations need to be doing to go a step further, a double click within the principles-based framework, is to think about how do you start with a proof of concept around risk management? How do you use data that's at your fingertips to start to track something that matters to the organization? Philip talked about a great point where you have to align it to strategy. Well, what better way for an executive to believe you as a risk management professional than to have some fact-based data at your fingertips? So, of course, there's no way that you're going to have a consultant sit on stage and not mention the term data. Sorry for that. But in terms of what we're seeing, we're asking organizations to start thinking about that risk register that Philip mentioned and start saying, look at it differently. Take a couple of those risks, for example, see how they could be permeated throughout the organization, see if there's ways in which data could tell you and maybe almost be a predictor of where that risk actually may happen in the future, right? We call it risk scoring, or in some cases you might call it risk flagging. But why I'm going into this level of detail on a more philosophical question is because I want the students to understand that as you move into your jobs and internships, et cetera, to be thinking about the way I think the needle's going to get moved is more and more organizations start to take this bottoms-up approach to truly align to the strategy of the company by saying, hey, no longer am I going to look at cyber risk as this big thing that IT manages where we just put some firewalls up or we do some tabletops, but what if I had data from my third parties, right? and basically predict where the bad actors might actually cause problems to my organizations. That's just in the world of bribery and corruption. Or what about fraud risk? What about some of these other areas where perhaps I can have some predictors to tell me, okay, maybe this is actually a bigger problem than we thought. It is linked to our strategy and more clear, and then someone will make a decision on it a little bit quicker than perhaps just interacting through a conversation, right? So we're moving from Phillips Point has to happen. We need to start having these task force together and interacting and talking about big things, but we also need to have it grounded in some information that actually can help the decision makers see through what might be just theoretical.
Yeah, I
Does
love
that
it.
make sense?
Philip,
Yeah, just
getting
a
back to you, but
quick
just
follow-up. So here are two questions, and it's a great segue to ask of yourself and the organization you work for. What are the top political, social, technological, and environmental issues that you see that might impact your organization? I know there's a lot of detail there, but what are the top political, social, technological, environmental issues that might impact your organization? Write them down, right? This is fodder for these discussions. Then you get the data, right? The next is, what are the most prevailing topics currently dominating your subject matter, your industry specific? So now you're getting more detailed. And from that, you can then start asking, which we call taskers, these leading questions. Okay, this is what I need to know about that. Go out and search and find this particular, I need you to answer this question for me. Who is doing this better than we are? Where are they? How did they get there? What are the risks that they've dealt with? Are they charting a course, or are we following? Right? Do we want to? So most of these people probably wanted to lead in their space. But you can't lead unless you know where you're going. And you've got to use some system to get good intelligence. This information collection system has to be vibrant. And again, I think this is one of the lessons of what we've just been through, right? To now utilize all of these data streams as an intelligence system. And it also flags risk for you, but it also flags opportunities, right? So go where the risk isn't, or maximize all of the resources that you have so you're not wasting human capital and putting an ecological burden down where you could do this operation somewhere else with less impact, right? So that's what we're doing now. That's really kind of this holistic idea of looking at the data, and also I wouldn't say predictive, but it is a bit of looking beyond the immediate.
Yeah. One example I'm able to share because it's public information and you can all read about this. Brad Smith is the president and general counsel at Microsoft, blogged about this about, I don't know, it's about a year now, but Microsoft he reports into Satya, by the way, but obviously has been with the company under many CEOs. And they were under DOJ investigation for bribes in various foreign geographies. We don't have to go into a ton of detail. They did an investigation like most companies do to Phillips Point, was very reactive. They didn't necessarily consider channel risk as something that bubbled up into their top 10. They definitely maybe had it on their ERM list, but didn't get the focus. Throughout the investigation, they started asking the question, which was profound of them, right, and unique in corporations, to say, why does this keep happening? This is our second or third or fourth one. Why is this happening to us? Why can we not be more proactive? And so this idea came about is, what if we had a scoring system to be able to predict where the next basically corrupt act may occur, and engage some parties, along the way in this, and build a solution that basically now, before actually a sale is consummated, they run a bunch of data through an algorithm that spits out, and again, he wrote all about this, so you can look it up and read about it in more detail, that actually says where potentially there's risk, and they will then decide if they're going to move forward with a deal. So finally, an example where a company of that stature put risk ahead of dollars. And it was written up, blogged about, discussed in a lot of, I think it'll be a great case study for university, wink, wink. But, I honestly think what I'm proud of in reading that was that a company decided to make a decision that was risk-based, based on data that they always had at their fingertips, but never actually put it together in a way that was first reactive and then predictive, and now they're continuing to use it today. So it's a great solution.
It's a wonderful story to segue into our next segment, which is opening it up to audience. But before doing that, I want to reflect on just the last observation. Would it be fair to say that Microsoft looked at the longer-term valuation impact of this kind of event one or bribery or what have you, corruption, versus a short-term transactional impact? So walking away from a short-term transaction, yes, but not so much walking away from a longer-term valuation impact, because that erodes trust on Microsoft's would-be potential partners, government or private sector. So they may, would it be fair to assume that I don't want to pigeonhole them as calculating as an organization, but I think every organization to some extent has to calculate all of these things. So I just wonder, a quick response on that one. Do you think they kind of wait and say, here's a longer term impact if we get branded as a corrupt company or to grow our business through corrupt means versus through proper means, and therefore it builds further trust into Microsoft?
Yeah, I mean, as a tech company, it's such an interesting dynamic there, because their principle that they say when they talk to anyone is Microsoft runs on trust. That is what they believe is their #1 way to get into the hearts and minds of all corporate and even now, whether you buy a Surface or, you know, if you ever bought a Microsoft phone, the three of you, all those things, were thought of, but everything has to run on trust. And so imagine if that's what they're telling everyone, and then they have these issues that come up. So in terms of your question, it was a massive reputation, because they're not going to be able to sell, everything from their cloud to their Surface tablet, et cetera, if the community or investor community or anyone believes that their technology doesn't run on trust. Now, there may be no problem with the underlying engineering or the code in any of their product. But the view from the outside public might say, well, look, if they don't care about corruption in XYZ geo, how could they have the foundational elements to put in good technology that I can then use for my business purposes? So you can see how left and right connect. And they thought, I might lose a little bit of revenue, but I'm actually going to gain a lot of trust in the organization by doing the right thing. So you can see why the blog happened, the story around it. It became, Wall Street Journal, fodder. So it was good.
Thank you for sharing. So it's time for us to open up to the audience here as well as virtually. So if we have some questions, Matthew, you want to read off those questions, please? Or Michael?
We're actually moving the mic up, so if you have a question, you can ask it. We also have a large online presence.
Okay.
A lot of questions there. This works, yes. So Rachel will be asking those, but since I have the microphone, they say never give a 2-year-old a microphone, but I have the microphone, so I'm going to ask a question if that's okay. So you both mentioned the contrarian role, and I love the use of that term, but what is the balance between problem seeking and solution mindedness in that role? What is that balance that you have to strike in that role?
Yeah, I'll take a swipe at this. I think the balance is, providing value to someone who's in a really difficult place trying to make a hard decision, right? That's the balance. I think where that balance gets tipped to the negative is when someone shows up and says, here's all the reasons why we shouldn't do this, whatever this might be, right? Because that might be true, but again, just thinking to the psychology of change, if you're trying to change someone to get them to do something you think is helpful, then giving them nothing but what it might be considered bad news, right, probably isn't going to help very much, right? Because they're going to react to that, it's going to seem overwhelming, right? So I think, and I don't know if this is a solution, but I think the idea is that you're there as a strategy advisor, right? What is your job? Your job is to help, I think in terms of aviation, so maybe this is a good analogy. I'm like the flight engineer, right? I'm looking and saying, well, here are some other things we need to be concerned about. You're flying the airplane, but I've also saw that we have another problem. right? Or there might be something that I have seen that you maybe didn't see or didn't focus on. So you're trying to provide value to the decision. That to me is the tipping point, right? And probably why risk management or any process seems to get put in a box is because it's considered not a value add, right? It's just even the title of some of the terms, right? Enterprise risk management. What does that mean if the C-suite doesn't even understand the terminology? Sometimes the terms get in the way. So I think the idea of you're there to be, part of helping to make a good decision, right?
Yeah, I would just add one quick note on that. First, fantastic question around solution mindfulness versus problem seeking. I might use that, so I'll footnote whoever said it. But I think in terms of letting the audience know that the CEOs, CFOs, executives have always had, I don't want to say a contrarian, but a strategy consultant that was by their side, right? We've heard about, they come from various consultancies, sometimes big names, small names. I think, but it wasn't colored in terms of what actually they do or not do. I don't think the organization was aware of it. A lot of you in the room were like, I didn't know that even role existed, and that it was a sizable expense on some of the P&Ls of organizations. But really now making it transparent, and what Philip really hit on that was perfect, was allowing the organization to see that through the lens of the employee lens, top to bottom, right? So it's not just, hey, here's my vision as CEO, you pay me $100 million in stock to come up with this, and then I have people helping me with it. Now it's using that throughout the organization to bring up both the good and the risks with the good, if that makes sense. And so it is going to be required for the person that asked the question, a unique, as I see this role unfolding, it's going to be a unique personality for someone to come in and not be digging. Like those of you that are familiar with internal audit departments, I'll often hear, I'll be brought in and say, hey, my internal auditor is just such a policeman or policewoman. I'm so tired of that, right? They got the gotcha mentality. No one wants that. No one wants someone to come into their office and say, hey, everything that you thought of is worthless, because of ABC. It's going to take a unique skill set, but I do think it's evolving. I think you're going to see a lot of retired executives come into this role, coming back into a company to advise, but have that transparency so that an organization, an employee who might be entry level might say, wow, is D&I really important to this organization? Okay, well, they're saying it, but oh, wow, they've hired now and they've created this task force to ensure that actually there's external views into how we're managing diversity within our organization. So it's a good example of how I think you're going to see things evolve. So, great question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I must say, there are probably a record number of questions that are coming in through our online platform. So I know we won't get a chance.
Is that good or bad?
It is good. It is good. And although we might not get a chance to get all of them today, again, if anyone here in the room has any questions, feel free to come up to the mic. In the meantime, let me build on the question of the human resource side. So what role, and this question comes in from Jennifer O'Brien, what role does human resources play in connecting that executive management with the employee when it comes to applying risk enterprise solutions and strategies?
You want to start or you want me to?
You can start.
Yeah, I mean, there was a big change, as you probably have seen in the last 5 years, that heads of HR are now called chief people officers, and that was a distinct change to allow them to play a broader role in the organization. HR was often viewed as their silo. They deal with hiring, firing, and employee benefits. And the answer to that is absolutely that's not the case. And what I'm seeing in forward-looking organizations is the chief people officer is at the table, just like Philip here as a chief risk officer is at the table during big decisions, because the impact across the swath of risk in an organization goes far beyond just impacting the employee. And that chief people officer who understands everything from diversity to ESG, right? We haven't talked even about amazing, again, a consulting sitting up here and not bringing up the ES and G. But again, it's important to know that the chief people officer in HR has a distinct role in understanding the G part of that, right? They're a leader within the organization. They know how to govern internally. And so there's a responsibility that they have So I would say that absolutely enterprise, like when I institute or help organizations institute ERM or IRM, which I like to refer to and can tell you about later, I think it always, I'm interviewing not only the chief people officer, but her or his direct lieutenants to truly understand what is being impacted in the org. And when you start then to risk rank and we talked about before the risk register and things bubbling up, you'd be amazed to see now what is moving into the top 10 that 5 years ago didn't exist as a risk in an organization. And it's everything from employee health and well-being. I mean, I can tell you as a PwC partner, the investment we're making in our people is in a massive number, in the billions, in terms of not only upskilling them, but in terms of helping them from a well-being, health, safety, and et cetera. So great question, thank you, and absolutely it's a responsibility now of either a CHRO or a CPO to be involved in all things ERM. So.
Yeah, I just would add, it just seems like everything we're talking about comes back to this idea of having this kind of team structure, right? So that it's not the, like I'm the executive director of risk, security, and resilience, and the chief risk officer and the chief human resource officer for the university, we're actually engaged in these conversations about quality of life. So what does that have to do with risk? Well, if we don't have employees who want to come back to work after COVID, it has profound impact on, the entire institution writ large. It's a risk. It says something about the institution if we're not agile enough to say we've changed, we've heard you. So I think along the ideas of this collaboration between HR, risk, just across the enterprise, that is going to make or break organizations through this really big, profound change about quality of life and what it means to work post-COVID. I mean, without risk and HR and leadership, I think some large organizations might see employees that just decide not to come back to work for a lot of different reasons that they just haven't considered in a holistic way. So it's probably the most critical aspect now of managing through this would be HR, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of data, and just a fun stat, PwC in the US is 55,000 people strong, and then if you add the global enterprise, it's about 220,000 last time I checked. We just did, and again, this is public information, but about 30% we offered to our people the ability to work from home or have a hybrid model, right? And a hybrid would mean anything from 5 days in the office to client site, right? As a consultancy and an audit practice, we're a unique organization because we're not always either in the office or at home. There's a third party, right? We go to client sites, we help deliver work at clients, but 30% of people decided to work from home. So if you can imagine that math, and that number is pretty consistent. I don't have all the data internationally yet, but if you can imagine, some people might look at that and say, well, that's not it. I thought it'd be bigger. But in reality, that number is a massive number to manage. And as a chief people officer, imagine what you now have responsibility over. Health and well-being used to be like, well, are people overworked, underworked? But now you think about their interaction just sitting at home and mental awareness, mental health. And so there's a number of things that aren't front and center when you're not seeing people every day. And so now all of a sudden that role, and I think you're going to find a very different, much like we talked about the chief contrarian, and hopefully that spurs some interest. But I think you're going to see a very different set of professionals being hired in quote unquote HR in the next, 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. And to shift focus now, a lot of what we've talked about are applicable to larger organizations, but we have a question that had come in that talks a little bit about the smaller organizations. So how might a small company or organization justify the spending necessary to manage risk? And it's actually a two-part question. That one came from Bill, and I'm also going to tie in James Furry's question, which then subsequently asked, is there any pros and cons to outsourcing risk management as opposed to managing it internally? So if we could tie those two questions together.
Yeah, I think the first question is, this is the risk reward calculus, right? So what investment would the business consider to help them get through some foreseeable risk, right? So it's like insurance. Why do you take insurance out, right? Because you're concerned that something might happen, and if it does, you want to be able to survive it. So I think to reframe or thinking about justifying spending, really the idea is you should look at it like an insurance plan, right? Anything that you're doing to make the organization more resilient and agile will pay off should the organization have to, go through this trial or whatever the situation might be. Smaller businesses, really, there's formats to do basic risk planning. It doesn't take that much money, frankly, to have a basic risk register, right? So I just look at it as like part of doing business. A prudent business should have some risk management embedded in it. In fact, we were talking about startups. It's usually the last thought is, the corporate governance of the startup. Without a format and clear lines of control, et cetera, you've built in risk to your startup. So it should be part of doing business, right? And then I think your second question, if you could just say it again quickly.
Yeah, so again, that was the pros and cons of managing risk internal to the organization or outsourcing that effort.
Yeah.
Again, if you're maybe a smaller organization.
I mean, there are lines of risk that you just cannot control as an organization. There are some that are outside your control, and you need to find other ways to control that risk, right? So I think the example of an organization that takes out an insurance policy in advance of a known or probable risk is an excellent example of, you've outsourced that risk to a certain degree, right? And you've taken insurance against the potential. All organizations ought to be doing that same calculus. What can we control? What can't we control? And what are the mechanisms that we can use to mitigate impact, right? Some of those are non-monetary. It's just changing certain structures and ways that you do business. It doesn't cost very much money to say, for instance, why do some organizations have different standards for health and safety? Because they've experienced some loss, right? And so now they have higher standards of health and safety. So you learn from that and say, let's not do this, right? So, I think I'll leave it at that, but I think, the idea of prudent risk transfer, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. The only thing I would add, on the second question, I might be a little biased in terms of, funneling risk to outsource providers, whether it be insurance or, a consulting firm or the like to help you think through it is always good. I believe very wholeheartedly that an outside perspective can actually shed light on a variety of topics. So I think it's a good thing to consider. What I would say on the first question is, back to my analogy on the brakes on the car, I think everyone needs them, right? The car needs some element of a brake system. It doesn't have to be something where it forces you to stop on a dime, right, and spend the kind of money to do that. I think there's a range there, but I do believe, and I would even say small companies have the agility to probably get together or interact with their leadership team on a more frequent, easier basis, right? If you think about organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees and executives spread out, it may be hard for them to interact at a level that a small business might be able to do. So risk management may not be as costly, for one, because it's everyone's responsibility, and you don't need to necessarily hire a professional to be a chief risk officer. You could have it embedded in the fabric of how they operate, as long as it's, again, thought of, as long as those breaks exist to allow you to have some calculated risk when you're making decisions. We often hear about, like you brought up a startup, and I always love to bring this up, but there's phenomenal startups out there, companies that have done extremely well, but the success rate is still well under 10% of a startup. In fact, it's closer to 1%. And so what we're not seeing often is the 99%, because they don't get the press as much. Obviously, we don't hear about them. But the idea of why they failed, I absolutely believe, and I know Philip would agree, that it's that not having an understanding of risk and the decisions that are being made are going to often lead to the demise of the organization. So, we don't hope that they fail, but they do provide some really good fodder to all of us to think about, how do you do this the right way? How do you take risk, but still have some gates and a way to understand exactly what decisions are being made.
Yeah.
Thank you. If there's no questions from the room, I'll keep going. This question comes in from Brenderly Cruz, and it kind of ties in some current events in the world today. So with the supply chain issues impacting risk management strategies, what thoughts do you have on that subject? And to tie in a question from Aman Gupta, are there any technologies or processes that you might share that might give organizational leaders that confidence to deal with some of these perhaps supply chain issues?
I won't talk too much about brands of technologies, but there are risk solutions that are commercially available that will essentially take your risk register and give you some clues as to where your risk might be embedded in your process. You might know more about these. But I will say a little bit about the supply chain issue. I think, again, this is maybe a wake-up call. Depends on how people react to it, frankly, right? About how dependent we all are on external resources for every organization. So, I'll just speak for California. There was a rush on toilet paper in California, where we have pretty strong supply chains when COVID started. And I suppose I understand that from a psychological perspective. I'm not a psychologist, but people were worried about something and they found a solution to that problem, right? So I think one lesson is think about what you're most dependent on. Now's a good time to think about that as an organization. What did you learn from this experience that tells you that you now need to be more agile by thinking about how to reinforce your supply? Is there another way of getting that resource? If not, is there a way to hedge against a total loss or impact that's so negative that it puts you in a position where your cars are now sitting waiting for chips, right? So on a macro level, all universities rely on students to get into the classroom, and we've had to change the way we do business for a while. I think it's a similar discussion. Okay, what have we learned in this? What can we do differently? Has this helped us to do something in a different way that's maybe better? Maybe we offer different experiences for students, and some like a hybrid model, some like totally online, and some want to be in the class. Can we offer all three platforms at the same time? Is there an advantage to that? So, I'll pivot a bit here and see what you think.
Yeah, no, both of those questions are interesting and appreciated. I think I'll take the first one for, and in terms of supply chain, it's no surprise that that's bubbling up. But I would say even before this crisis that we're in, and it is a crisis around getting goods to the end user, I would say that third-party risk management was a massive issue. And it is, and I will tell you that, that it is bubbled up to be on the top 5 or top 10 of most organizations today, where it wasn't a few years ago. There was a view that, I don't want to say church and state, but there was a separation of risk in terms of your third parties and, what's controlled within an organization. That ship has sailed. And so today, organizations need to absolutely prioritize third-party risk management. I think of it as privacy is a bigger concern than just getting goods from A to Z, because all of a sudden now your data, your information, right, is now being used with multiple different stakeholders that you're not aware of. And so there's a lot of technology out there that's commercial that you can get into that. But think about it as it's not just the relationship between you as an entity and the first party supplier. Think about their downstream and who else supplies parts to them. You think about Boeing, we talked about them as a great company up in the Northwest, but hundreds of thousands of suppliers. Imagine how chaotic it is to manage that process and who's responsible. So I would absolutely say that's a concern. And when you even peel back the onion further in the supply chain, think about it as also, you mentioned a great question about HR and people officer. Think about now, part of the supply chain issue isn't that we don't have the raw material, it's that we don't have the people to actually create the widget to then go into the next widget that gets into XYZ product. And so there is a challenge and an employee, it's not a shortage of humans, it's a shortage of people that desire to do that job. And so now you have basically, how does an HR professional or people officer deal with keeping people in their job, coupled with what that third party looks like. So I now interact with clients to think about how they are impacting the supply chain, not just from, hey, I'll pay you more, but I need you to tell me, are your employees sound, and are they going to create well thought out product to get to my end user? The example I'll give that's interesting is I'm working with an exercise company that produces exercise equipment, and they have a huge procurement group. They have multiple responsibilities. They've shifted 100% of them into just finding new suppliers. So imagine all the other risks that are now coming up. Of course, I shed light on those, but it's the challenge of how do you now have 50 people scouring the planet to look for a specific raw material, specific good, to dig into their product that customers are demanding, right? We're all working from home and we want more exercise equipment in our house per se. So think about that issue there. That's not just about, the actual product itself, but it's actually the people. And then finally, just in terms of the second question, I don't want to at all plug, PwC has a product. It's great. You can read about it. It's called Risk Command. It's incredibly interesting as one of the developers, but I would say it's still in its infancy. There's many other solutions out there that help companies both do due diligence on suppliers, that look at, like you said, taking a lot of data sets and we'll say culminating them into a story. There's a lot of folks that are still dealing with the reactive and putting it in a workflow. So there's a lot of pieces, and maybe one of the things I'll offer up, Maneesh, to you and to your team is we can get into a lot of that. I will commit to come back on campus and maybe come to one of the classes and can get into a little bit of that with the students to talk about, okay, here's the solution, right? A technology that's out there, and here's kind of their business plan. How does that align, right? And to think about risks that exist. So maybe something we can do at a future date.
Thank you. And it's really hard to choose just one final question. We'll try to get these questions consolidated after and address some of the other great ones that have come in. But we talked a little bit about the tangible. Let's talk a little bit about the intangible. So and you touched earlier on the Facebook aspect, but with these social platforms, they've undoubtedly done good for the world in terms of connecting. They've presented societies and governments with additional challenges, whether it's false information, freedom of speech, leading obviously to, in some way, shape, or form, somewhat of a diverse of a world. So what is and in that, of course, there's the inherent risk. So what are your thoughts on how the intangible can be managed, or just in general, this theory of social media, what's happening online?
Save the hardest one for last. Thank you for that. You want to start?
Well, one of the subjects that I teach is ethics. So I'm going to use that lens right now. And, I think we learn, this is a bit of a philosophical answer, question or response to a direct question, but I think we learn, through trial and error, right? And we learn how we want to be or how we don't want to be, and that's part of growth, right? So I'm not sure if there's actually a solution to this through technology. Maybe there is something that could filter some way, but ultimately, I look at it, in human nature is to say, I don't want to do that, I want to do this, or I've learned that that's not helpful anymore because I went through this crucible, right? So I look at social media as kind of a reflection of what you want or what you don't want and why. And it teaches you something about yourself and others. And that to me is about as positive as I can be about it. I just look at it as like a reflection of what society wants or doesn't want and how they navigate that. So I'm hoping that there's going to be, in my heart of hearts, kind of a course correction that says, am I beholden to, or is this a resource? Because I've seen GoFundMe accounts that have helped people in horrible situations, which you would never be able to harness those resources on a worldwide scale. So that's clearly helpful, in my view. And then you've seen the other extreme, right, where something's happened and it's not contributed, it's actually made the situation worse. like any part of society, there's a certain adjustment. This technology is so new. You know, I mean, there used to be fears about radios in homes, right? So I think there'll be, hopefully, that this is the, I guess this is my parting, you know, the positive part of risk management is to try to see how this might be course corrected over time, and people will learn something about what they want or don't want as humanity.
Yeah, I think we're in an age where, you know, disruption's just happening faster, but it always existed. The radio is a great example. The TV was just massive disruptor in terms of, you know, both families' homes and how, you know, that changed our views on a variety of topics. I would say to that question, what I think is going to help is the intangible becoming tangible. I think organizations, to Philip's point, need to take, there's an ethical decision here that's going to be in front of us around taking responsibility to be transparent, right? We all have at least heard of, and I suggest you all to read the Facebook files, not because, you know, I think negative or positively about the company. I'll leave that alone. But I do think that there's a great learning in there as a risk professional or someone that's, at least if you're here or you're listening, you're interested in risk management, because there's a fascinating study in all of those in terms of what was done and what wasn't done. And then as a risk professional, what would you have done? And start thinking about that, talk with your peers about it, because it's real stuff, right? Whether it's, you know, content for teenagers or whether it's whitelisting or, you know, et cetera. They're all super important topics today. But I think what's in front of them is the ability to move from intangible to tangible. Can they possibly showcase to the world, like, look what we are doing in order to manage this incredibly complex problem, right? And the more transparency that exists, I believe, will actually allow folks to maybe, I don't want to say humble, like the big Facebook to everyone, but I do think that there will be a different story that's played out. It's not like we have all this power and we're just trying to make money. They're actively trying to manage these risks, and how they're doing it may just not be clear. The more that they provide a clear layout on how hard these challenges are and what they are doing, I think it's going to open the eyes and become more tangible to you and I to say, wow, this is a profound issue and this is hard, but someone is actually taking steps, as we talked about, the building blocks, using the data at their fingertips to start, you know, providing that transparency. But thank you for those.
Okay, so we're going to end with this last question. So that wasn't the last question.
Oh, all right.
So, yeah,
One more, please.
There's one. We have lots of students in the audience and virtually. So we have to ask this question, so thank you. Lots of students, and we recognize that organizations, as we've all talked about it, are people, not machines. So with that in mind, what advice would you give students that are coming up nowadays and the future leaders so that they can become more agile and have an agile and resilient mindset themselves, and thus help to make the world a better place?
Yeah, I'll start. I think being inquisitive is a huge advantage today. I think, you know, even the huge amount of interns and new employees we employ, you know, I find that the ones that excel and the ones that are doing extremely well are the most inquisitive. Not always the most well-trained, not always the smartest, at least in terms of their grade average. But I think that is one thing, to always ask questions. And what you heard from Philip and I about the contrarian view is a good thing, right? Maneesh and I, as friends and colleagues, challenge one another. I think it's good to do it in a respectful way, but to know that just always saying yes or going with the flow because that individual sounds like they have been around the block a lot, right? You know, you can use your mind to ask questions, and doing it in a way that shows collaboration, mindfulness, versus just a naysayer, right? And even when I read on some of the young people that I'll read, including my kids, you know, who will post things, it's really interesting where, you know, you're quick to react. My other point would be, you know, take a moment to think through what is in front of you and bring a point of view that's thought out, not just reacting in the moment. I find that too often we see this in business and universities where we're all being pushed by boards, chancellor, et cetera, to make decisions
And the
quickly.
provost.
you know,
we're
provost, you know,
Yeah.
but I think we have to take a minute. So asking a lot of questions is great, and then truly taking a minute to digest. I have on my screen at home where I'm still working from home, it says notice and breathe. It's super important to not just come with your gut reaction. Take a second and think through what you have in front of you, and I bet you're going to come up with a well thought out answer. You know, one of the reasons I love PwC and why I've worked here, the average age is 28, by the way, and everyone comes to the table with that mindset of like, hey, it's okay to challenge. It's a flat organization. That's how we're better. We're helping clients solve really important problems. We need to challenge one another, but do it in a thoughtful, mindful way. I think that's going to create the next set of future leaders, and I'm sure many here will go on to do great things. So.
Absolutely. Wonderful advice. Philip?
I'll try to stick to the rule of threes. The first I would say is develop and keep a list of questions. You know, I've got a list of questions that I started probably 35 years ago. And some of them are, why am I doing this? Is there a better way to do what I'm doing? Who am I helping? Just develop your own internal list of questions and keep it. You know, keep it. And ask yourself when you start and when you finish these questions to yourself and sometimes to your friends. Why are we doing this? Is there anything we can do better? If your goal is to help, then ask, how am I helping? Am I helping the situation here? Is this meaningful? Is it good? These are good things that then lead to better things, right? The next is interact with people that you really disagree with, right? It's so painful to say that because it's hard to do. But, you know, from different cultures, from different perspectives, from all different ways of looking at issues, because generally, if you're there to help, you're going to help them along their journey. They're going to help you along your journey. And, you know, and ultimately, I think, finally, and this is a bit philosophical, is finish with that question, you know, how can I help make things better? I think every one of us, when we think about risks, or rewards, ultimately what we're trying to do is make things just better, right? For those that we work with, for the organization that we serve. And that, I mean, you can very rarely go wrong if you ask, how can I make things better? So.
Yeah, I would almost, I love your list of three, and I often talk in threes. I would also add that, you know, when you've established your internal values, like even getting to know you last night and interacting, you can start to see someone in the way they ask questions and the way they speak and things, what values are important to them, and stick to those, right? I think that so often we in business or try to make, you know, enough money to support our families, et cetera, we derail a little bit, and everyone's guilty of it at some point, right? So don't worry about failing, but stick to your values, and I guarantee you'll help more than you'll hurt by a long shot. So, but thank you for that question, and thank you everyone. And if there are others, I will offer up too. The class that is something exciting, but if someone has a really super, you know, important question they want to get out, our emails can be provided, and you can, or at least my email can be provided, and you can send them to the group, and happy to answer questions separately.
Absolutely. I think wonderful discussion. I think to Philip, you and Sean, you both, we're going to conclude with that question. Wonderful sage advice there. I think, you know, just just remaining open-minded, and what I would agree, remaining open-minded and just accepting that one may not have all the solutions, no matter how advanced one may be, has been helpful. So again, I want to thank you, Sean, for being here. Thank you, Philip, for being here. By the way, I'm going to plug for Philip. He has a book, Failure is an Option. You know, so, you know, you can get on Amazon and kind of Amazon it now. I mean, I just turned into another verb, Amazon it, that book, Failure is an Option. So look it up. You might find it to be an interesting read. I want to thank the Chancellor, who was here, unfortunately had to leave because he has a meeting coming up at 11:30. So here's a book, Failure is an Option. And half of the proceeds when you purchase this book go to the Dean's Excellence Fund. So Philip did not know that, but he does now, because we've talked quite a bit about transparency, so I'm just being transparent.
I think it's supposed to be done beforehand, though, right?
Proactive.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's nothing like putting some pressure on. And thank you, Provost, for being here. And thank you to the students, my dear colleagues here, for bringing some of your students. Do want to recognize, we have Michael here, our newly stood up student council. So thank you, a special shout out to him. And of course, a shout out to Rachel Vignes here. She runs our communication. Everything looks good here. My team here, Jules sitting there, Michael standing back there. And of course, Matthew keeps me within the boundary lanes. He's my boundary here. Okay, don't veer too far away. So he is my
Chief contrarian.
chief contrarian always. That's his role, and I relish that role that he plays, and he plays it constructively. So thank you, Matthew, and to my colleagues who've taken the time to be here. Jim, thank you. Denise, thank you as well. And with that, we're going to conclude this session. If you have any questions that are left over, Rachel, you can shoot those over to me. I'll forward those to Philip and Sean. And then we'll continue this dialogue going. I'm going to do a plug once again for our graduate programs. If you're really interested in this stuff, our MBA program and the management program are really focused on. Sean has been helpful in providing feedback, and will continue to, he didn't say it, but we'll continue to provide feedback and engage with us. Doing another plug for him. So thank you, Sean, for that as well. With that, we will close out this Vantage Point discussion. We encourage you to stay tuned. This thing will be posted, Rachel, on the YouTube channel, so you can watch it in case you missed it. Or you found it so exhilarating that you have to watch it again. You can do that as well. And why not? So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Philip.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
And have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thank you.